cloud. Okay, and share my screen. And we'll do this one. Share. Okay, before I do get started, couple of quick notes. First of all, apologies again about that mess with the breakout rooms. I genuinely can't figure out what's wrong there because we did everything that they said and it should have in fact restricted you all from access. And what it seemed to do instead was restrict some people from access and let anybody else in. So it sounds like it might have been designed by some Zoom bomber to create a backdoor so they can get in and nobody else can. I don't know what was going on. But what we've decided to do, I'm going to stop sharing a second because I see it's messed my screen up. What we're going to do is we're going to instead use we're going to use independent Zoom rooms for everybody. And that has its own problems, one of which is nobody will know where they're going from one class to the next. And we also can't easily do preliminary announcements before a class because they're in 3 different rooms. But I've tried to address that by inviting you all using the calendar invite. I've set up all 3 Zoom rooms for the sections. And what will happen is if you are invited, if you're invited to whatever section you're in now is going to be your section for the whole year. So you were only invited to one section. And then you'll just stay there and then we'll rotate through that, Dylan, Rachel, and I. And if you subscribe, I'm going to put a link in the calendar that you can use if you haven't already done this. You can also subscribe to a calendar that we've made. Where the chat is, I'm popping it right here. If you subscribe to this link, this gigantically long link, that has calendar events for all of our assignments, as well as our rooms for both classroom and the section rooms. And then what I also did today was I subscribed everybody or invited everybody to the main classroom, the one you're in right now, and changed it so that it only shows up on Mondays. And if we have to change anything, if we suddenly need to have a plenary session midweek or on a Friday or something going forward, I'll change the calendar entry so you'll actually get information that way. Okay? Does everybody know, or is there anybody who doesn't know how to subscribe to a calendar? Oh, the link's not working. Thank you, Madison. I'll fix the link then and then redo it, but I'll send it by email. I may have changed permissions or something. Is there anybody who doesn't know how to subscribe or use calendars or invites, or is there anybody for whom that's not a very useful approach? Not hearing anything. We'll hope it's good. If you have issues, you can email me about it. Great. Any questions before I start? Administrative questions? Does anybody here want or need the link to the Discord now that add drop dates are passed? I don't know what that means. Have you guys got a class Discord going?
Yeah.
Ah, how interesting. I actually was experimenting with it yesterday, so don't think you're so hip. I was actually debating, we're using Twist to communicate about you amongst ourselves. And then I was thinking maybe I ought to set up Discord too, just because I'm that gaming kind of person. Okay. Anyway, any other questions or comments? You guys chat about us, we'll chat about you, and then we'll meet here to compare notes. Okay, not hearing any questions, then I'll get started. What I'm going to do today is really summarize what we've done over the last week and why we've been doing it, because this was really very much a crash course in some grammatical terminology. And it's not a course in grammar. So we are going to be picking this up again and again and again, these techniques, but you'll get used to the techniques through use rather than something that you've got to learn right away. We will have a test on this. I think it's like in a week, 10 days, something like that. I've still got to make the questions up. We're not 100% sure how we're going to do it, although I'm guessing it'll probably be some combination of a couple of custom questions and things I've taken from Murray's page, his examples, maybe adjusted to really get at this use of syntax, which I'm about to talk to about. And then the important thing to keep in mind is basically everything this year, except for your final paper and your final exam, is graded on two bases. First of all, a pass-fail basis. You do it, they're all pretty much all formative work, which means you do it or you don't. And if you're making a good faith effort, then we count it. And if you're not, then we'll speak to you. But we will also give you indicative grades. So when you do this first test, for example, you'll get a score. And that score, you know, will be a percentage. It doesn't mean anything unless you do extremely well. And if you do extremely well, we have badges that we give out on pretty much all pieces of work for work that's really exceptionally outstanding in some way. As a rule, that means, let's say, in the A range, but it's not exactly the same as an A for two reasons. One is that sometimes the reason I actually developed this was occasionally I'll get really excellent work that doesn't do what the assignment says. So somebody will write an astounding paper, but I wasn't asking for a paper, I wanted them to do a test instead. And it seemed to me that there needed to be some way to reward really good work for that. And the second is that in some cases, doing A work is not really that exceptional, right? And so, you know, it's pretty hard to do an astounding quiz on what, you know, an astounding effort on a quiz. What text are we supposed to be reading today? You know, it's hard to see that as excellent. And for Rosemary's question, it doesn't matter. You're getting bonuses doesn't necessarily harm one's internal motivation, but you're also welcome to refuse it. Okay, any questions about that before I get started? Okay, hearing nothing, we'll get started then. Hopefully you guys are seeing the title page of the slide, is that right? Okay, great. So basically we're going to talk about two things today. I had taken something out and I've just put it back. We're going to talk about what we learned this week and how come, and go and sort of summarize some of the things. Every section has done it slightly differently and covered slightly different things. That's not a problem because, first of all, that means we all have different, we have, let's say, amongst us a full picture of what we're going to be doing. And this is introducing you to techniques that we're going to be using and terminology that we're going to be using. But what I want to do today is to draw together some of the core things that, that I'd really like you to know and understand why we were doing it. And I've already done the announcements, but at the very end, I'll give you something that will help you as you think about your getting ready for the first translations next week. So what have we been doing? This class this week has been, and the beginning of last week, has been about the grammar of present-day English, the syntax and morphology of present-day English. And specifically, we've been looking at three different things. We've been looking at word classes, also known as parts of speech, inflectional morphology, in Murray's chapter known as changes in the forms of words, grammatical function, which Murray is calling parts of the sentence. A quick note, that terminology is real, that terminology difference. There's different ways of understanding grammar. Murray's presented you with one combination of sort of multiple approaches, and we're presenting you with a slightly different one. Is a little bit more closely related to the way that it's taught in our linguistics department or linguistics classes, if you've taken that. And if you've been trained in the way that Dylan and I particularly were in more traditional philological grammars, I actually wouldn't mind you learning it this way. And the reason, as I'll show you as we go through this, is there's something quite specific about the way modern contemporary syntax and morphology studies handle syntax and morphology that makes it particularly useful for us. So if you've been traditionally trained, now you get to have two dialects. And if you haven't been trained at all, then learn this one. And so we also supplemented what's in Murray's chapter by providing some context, background context, and systematizing it a little bit. And as I've sort of hinted at, Murray's presentation is a hybrid between traditional and contemporary approaches to present day English grammar. And the things that we got you to do is because we have a specific reason for wanting you to learn this. So why have we been doing it? Well, there's a couple of important points to keep in mind. The first is that this is about the systematic study and use of grammar, grammatical terminology, and it's not actually about knowing or learning grammar. We mentioned this, or I mentioned this in my Friday lecture last week, but I also saw it come up in the blogs a few times about people feeling, oh, I don't know my grammar or whatever, and I really want to emphasize everybody on this call knows present-day English grammar. If you didn't, nobody would understand a word that you said. What you haven't done necessarily is learn the terminology or studied it systematically. And I was talking to somebody about this in my office hour, I think, and I was saying it's a little bit like being, running the Boston Marathon and being a kinesiologist. People who do well at the Boston Marathon, I think we can take as read, know how to run. They just don't necessarily know the physiology of running or the terminology of the movements or even maybe comparative understanding of how the pieces go together. They may not even know what's different between what they, different or the same between what they do and the other runners, but that doesn't mean they don't know how to run. It just means they haven't studied running or the science of running. And so we're doing the science of running, except in this case, speaking. And second, and this is something we've been really emphasizing, syntax and morphology, that is to say grammar, is about the structure of sentences. It's not about their meaning. And there's this famous sentence from Chomsky, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, which he uses to show the sentence, if you stop and think about it for a second, doesn't really make a lot of sense, and yet it does make sense. So it makes sense grammatically and syntactically, but from a semantic perspective, it's hard to imagine what a colorless green idea is. And it's also hard to imagine how you could sleep furiously. And it's also hard to imagine how an idea could sleep furiously. Now, because we're system people, we could all build a backstory that makes this make sense, but that's not the point. This at a surface level just doesn't make sense, but it also does make sense from a syntactic level. And then the third thing that I emphasized on the Friday was the reason why we're learning this is because our Old English is so bad. That when we study Old English and when we're doing our translations, we're going to be looking words up in the back of the book. We won't have any innate sense of how Old English works, but we'll be reading something is a noun. It's in the nominative case. That means it's the subject. And then we have to convert that to English, modern English, which we do have intuitive feels for. And unless we manage to get our terminology to line up, what's going to happen is as you make the transition, your intuitions will take over and you'll be driven by your sense of rhythm and feel of our language rather than what you learned about it in Old English. It's really common for people to have a hard time to say this word in Old English means this, is a noun, is the subject, and then turn it in modern English into a verb that's obviously not the subject then. So that's why we're training you to do this as a check on your translations. So this emphasizes something that I saw some of you have commented on the blogs, that basically when we're translating Old English, we've got two translation issues coming. The first is semantic and lexical, what we kind of think of when we think of translation, which is what does it mean? And so we're going to look up Old English words, and then we're going to ask ourselves, how do I represent what this Old English word means in present day English? And then we have a second translation question, which is how do I represent the way this Old English word fits into the Old English sentence? How do I represent that relationship in present day English? And the first of those is pretty easy, or at least pretty straightforward, because we're used to doing this. You're going to go look up the word in the dictionary. That's how you'll know what a word means. Um, Although I've got an asterisk there because you're going to hear me say this a lot throughout the year. It's very common when you're translating languages, especially dead languages, it's really common to think that an Old English word, let's say like König, word meaning king. Well, actually, I just did what I'm not supposed to do. The Old English word König, which is etymologically related to our word king, and amongst other things can mean king. But it's very common for us to think that the dictionary is providing a direct equivalence and that the Old English word König means king. But it doesn't. The Old English word König means König. We think that the semantic range of that word in modern English is king. And so you're going to see that a lot where you're going to be tempted to say, oh yes, this word means that, X means Y. But in fact, it's not the case. X means X, and Y is an approximation of what we think X means in this context. So sometimes you're going to find that what the dictionary says is not necessarily 100% exactly what we need for the context. And even in introductory textbooks, you'll find that there's times where you're going, I'm not sure he's got that right. And you can also find out how a word works in Old English, how it works in the Old English sentence by looking it up in the glossary, and especially in a beginning book like this, it'll tell you. It'll say, this is the nominative, and my cheat sheet and things we'll teach you next week will tell you, and that means the subject. But that's the hard part, though, is you then have to try and express that in translation by using the closest or most idiomatic present-day English construction to translate that grammatical relationship. And again, that's got an asterisk beside it because exactly how you do that is an art rather than a science. You could really emphasize more idiomaticness, or you might emphasize more getting the words in kind of the order and expressing the relationships, even if that sounds unidiomatic in modern English. And how we find the balance is something we'll be negotiating as a class all semester. A question that you're all going to ask as we go through this is, okay, but is that how I say that on the final exam? And the answer is maybe. It really depends on what you are doing, how you've established the rest of your translation. Your translation will establish for us a sense of how you're working, and then maybe that's the right way of doing it. One of the things we do in the translation sections, why we do so much translation in class, is so you can get a sense of what works and what doesn't in terms of this trying to express it in modern English grammar. So the tests we learned this week are by and large meant to help us with that last part, because that's where things often go wrong with students. Students don't have any problem when you look up König and find out that an English equivalent is king. There rarely seems to be much of a problem unless the sentence is complex or something. But people very commonly will look at the word in Old English, recognize what it is, and then mistranslate it grammatically when they move across. And so these tests are a way of us testing this to ensure that we can say, first of all, what the equivalent would be in modern English, and secondly, check that we've actually translated it that way. And so that raises the last important point of what we've been trying to get at this week. And this is where we probably are a little bit more focused and maybe ideological even about it than Murray's chapter is. Murray's really teaching you the grammatical terminology, but we've been trying to teach you a specific way of applying tests. And what we've been really doing is trying to emphasize, do not rely on your understanding of the content. And the reason is not because it's bad or it's wrong. Nouns do, for example, typically have a naming function. That's part of their definition. But if you start doing that, you'll end up, those tend to be quite weak tests. They can be very, very ambiguous in terms of whether or not you've done something. And they're calling your intuitions into play, which is where the problem is going to come in the first place. So we really want you to try and avoid thinking about the context when you're trying to determine, have I translated an Old English noun correctly as a present day English noun? We want you to use syntactic tests that don't rely on what it means. And so if you find yourself giving an appeal to a backstory, saying, well, probably Beowulf had like a younger brother and he was probably related to like Wealhtheow, and so that's how come he's Beowulfing. It's like because of the verb, like if you got a brother and you're related to the queen, then you kind of Beowulf, like you older brother it. You can see how you're going to end up in trouble if you do that. I mean, you might not be quite as stupid as that, but nevertheless, don't worry, you will have opportunities to come up with dumb things if you appeal to a backstory. And backstories are almost always bizarrely funny. If you're interested in an interesting article on this, by the way, this is also an issue of literary criticism. I think it's Stanley Fish wrote a great article, How Many Children Did Lady Macbeth Have? Which is talking about, in the 19th century, people did their literary criticism that way. They sort of construct backstories for characters. We don't want appeals to logic as much as possible. Sometimes we're going to have to, but generally not, for the same reason. As American politics is showing us right now, you can use logic every which way. Just because you can make a logical case doesn't mean you're right. It's just, you know, we're crazy creatures for making up logic, so try to stay away from that. And please try not to appeal to sense. You know, so yeah, it's probably Beowulf's the adjective because he's pretty fierce, and it's a sword. That's not a very good grammatical test. So we want you to stay away from appeals to backstories, logic, and sense. And instead, we want you to use syntactic tests. And as I've said here, and I've given an example at bottom, take a word like moneta. All of the other words are related to that. So you could end up going, well, money, no, monetary, no, monetize. And I've just moved into 3 different word classes, all of which are related to the Latin word. And you can see how I'm going to have trouble. So focus on syntax, not meaning. We've had 4 resources. Murray's chapter 1, the essential grammars 1, 2, and 3. We've been focusing primarily in most of the sections, although the other 2 sections did a bit more, it sounds like, on inflections than I did, on essential grammar 2 and 3. And we'll keep coming back to that as we move on for the semester. Are there any questions so far? Because then what I'm going to do next is basically just summarize the material that we did. Just go through some of the tests, go through the domain, things like that. But are there any questions first? You can put up your hand, or you can write in the chat, or you could presumably even just yell out. You put up your hand, by the way, at the bottom of the screen, you click on participants, and then you'll see all the names, and you can just, there's a put up your hand button on your participant screen. Okay, no sign of any questions. I will keep going. So this is now a summary of what, sort of bringing together the things that we did. And because it was so example-based, at least if you were in my section, you probably were missing the overview. And so what I'm trying to do is now extract it from the work that we did. So the broad domain that we've been working on is the terminology that you see here. We were talking about open class and closed class words. And open class words break into nouns, adjectives, what I call lexical adverbs, and lexical verbs. And closed class words fall into pronouns, conjunctions, prepositions, articles / determiners. That's a bit of an ambiguous area for me with this. And then non-lexical adverbs and non-lexical verbs. And I should say what I mean by that, lexical verbs versus non-lexical verbs, and non-lexical adverbs versus lexical adverbs, is the verb to be is basically non-lexical. It expresses a relationship. Most of our modals, things like will, have, you know, those don't really have an intrinsic meaning. They express a relationship, tense, equivalency, or something like that. Same's true in adverbs. An adverb, and that's as opposed to a lexical verb like jump or monetize, both of which have real content to them. So what they mean is intrinsic to them. Same true of adverbs. An adverb like very doesn't really have a lot of meaning. It's an intensifier. It does something to words, but it doesn't, you know, what does very mean? It's hard to define. quickly, on the other hand, or ostentatiously, are both adverbs that have real meaning. And so when you use them, they have, you can make them up, and part of their importance is what they add to the sentence in terms of content. So the lexical adverbs and lexical verbs are open class, and all the other things down there, pronouns, conjunctions, prepositions, articles, and those non-lexical adverbs and verbs are closed class. And we also talked about grammatical function, and these are some of the ones that we dealt with. Ones in square brackets are things that came up in our classes but are not really talked about in Murray's chapter. So we talked about, in his terms, subject and predicate. I'm going to come back to that. We talked about adverbials. I don't know, lexical adverbs managed to sneak in over there. Adjectivals and objects or complements are terms. Murray called them objects. I've called them several times complements. And finally, we talked about inflections, at least in my section, fairly briefly, and they fall into declensions and cases and conjugations, and we also call them inflections. So probably the most important thing we did was to do with the word classes and the tests there. And depending on how it was taught in your section, you may or may not have got an overview of this, but in broad terms, we use 3 different kinds of tests. We use morphological tests, that is to say, we checked whether or not it can take a specific ending. We use positional tests, and that is to say, certain kinds of words can appear in certain sorts of places or can move in certain ways, and they can be preceded or followed by other kinds of words. And so that's how we would check if something is there. And we also did substitutions. We would check to see, can I substitute this word or combination of words with something else? And those are all really, really good syntactic tests, and they don't necessarily rely on meaning particularly. And then, as I mentioned on the Friday, all of these tests are by introspection. So if you didn't speak English, it would be very hard to do them because you do need some kind of sense of a feel, can I do this? And basically what we did in every case is you would run the test by changing something in the sentence, and then you would listen to the sentence, and if the sentence meant the same thing except for the thing you changed, then you had a successful test. So to give an example, if I say Susie lived, that girl Susie lives over the mountain, and I want to know what that girl Susie is, if I can replace her with she, well, I've eliminated a lot of lexical information, right? I've eliminated that girl Susie, but it's still the same sentence, except I just don't know as much about Susie anymore. So I know I'm good. The change I made, putting she lives over the mountain, does exactly what I thought it would do. So that and doesn't change the meaning of the sentence. On the other hand, if I replace it with, if I replaced Susie with she by itself, that girl, she lives over the mountain, that's not a neutral change. That's like created a person called she or something. It's not the same sentence anymore. So that test didn't work, right? The thing I'm replacing with she is bigger than Susie. It has to be that girl Susie. Whoops, sorry, wrong screen. So here's some examples of morphological tests that we used. You may not have covered all of them, and these are not all of them. Between Murray's chapter and my Essential Grammar 2, there's a fairly complete list of them. But for example, nouns are the only words that can take apostrophe S possessives. Not a great one, but it's true. Adjectives, and these are all apply specifically to English. They're not cross-linguistic in any way. Adjectives are the only things that can take a comparative form in ER or a superlative in EST. Verbs are the only words that can show tense. And pronouns are the only words that have 3 cases in modern English: a subject, an object, and a possessive. A couple of quick things about this. In all the other slides, you're going to see me say nouns or noun phrases. Adjectives are adjective phrases, and maybe even adverbials. Adverbs, adverb phrases, maybe adverbials. Verbs and verb phrases. But that's not true here, because inflectional morphology only works on the words. So you can't use any of these tests to discover, is that girl Susie, is that a noun phrase? You can use these tests to figure out if Susie is a noun, right? So you can say Susie's, she could possess something. Yeah, she's a noun. Okay. Positional tests are really good ones for the kind of way we like you to do it, because movement and location are things that are really good for our language. Later on, I'll talk about the difference between Old English grammar and modern, not today, but later, between Old English grammar and modern English grammar. And what I'll say is that Old English, I like to describe it as being like a flag language. This is a gross generalization, but it does an awful lot of syntactic work with endings in a way that we don't. And there's lots of evidence that Old English scribes, if they have to choose between word position and inflectional endings, they will accept the inflectional ending as correct, and they will just figure there's something wrong about word position. We're the opposite. If a word's in the right slot, we're a slot language. If the word's in the right slot, we'll generally ignore inflectional problems and just allow word order to override. So that's why positional is so good with present day English. So only nouns and noun phrases can be preceded by attributive adjectives. That means, you know, if I've got a noun like book, I can put old in front of it. But if I have a word like he runs quickly, I can't put he old runs quickly. You can't, that's a modifying one. You can't modify verbs with adjectives, but from our perspective, you also can't just immediately precede a noun with an attributive adjective. You can think of examples that seem to violate this. For example, you know, there's an English slang where in a family where you'll talk about the old versus the young. So kids will call their parents the old, and parents will call their kids the young. And there's obviously something that is, formally speaking, normally an adjective, but in fact, in this use, it's a noun. Even though it's, you know, normally you'd say that's an adjective, the usage, the old are upstairs drinking their martinis, the young are downstairs playing video games. In each of those cases, old and young are actually, syntactically speaking, nouns. So often, if you can think of a counterexample, you got to be careful because the word may have changed class from its normal class. Only nouns and noun phrases can be governed by determiners. And we've seen that a lot in a sentence like the young girl Susie. The is at the far left of the noun phrase, the thing I can replace with she. And so that's evidence that Susie's governed by a determiner. And that's a great test, by the way, with nouns, because putting an a or a the or a this or a that in front of it rarely changes the sentence in any major way, but it's very clear to you what, as a native speaker of English or an accomplished speaker, L2 speaker of English, it'll be very clear to you which word this is pointing to. Only adverbs and adverb phrases or adjectives and adjective phrases can be preceded by intensifying adverbs like really and very. So if we apply, you take a word like I run quickly, I want to know what quickly is. Is it an adjective or an adverb? That I can't tell. But I can tell that it's not a noun or something else because I can put really in front of it. I run really quickly. And that means it's either an adjective or an adverb. And we'd have to find other tests to see which one it is. And in fact, we could use the next one. Only adverbs and adverb phrases and adverbials can be moved freely among phrases in a sentence. This is a great test for adverbs. Adverbs are the only part of speech that can appear anywhere in the sentence and not affect meaning. But by anywhere in the sentence, I mean between phrases. You can't put them inside phrases, only certain kinds of phrases, but you can move them anywhere within the sentence or within the phrase they're in. So take that sentence I gave you. I run quickly. I run very quickly. So I know now it's an adjective or an adverb, but I don't know which one it is. And you can't rely on the ly, by the way, which you're often taught in traditional grammar, because friendly is an adjective, right? So we don't know yet, but I can say quickly I run, I quickly run, I run quickly, and all three of those make sense. The fact I can move it around tells me it's an adverb. I run really quickly, I run. I run really quickly, I really quickly run. Finite verbs, and we'll talk more about what that means later on, are preceded by subjects in modern English in sort of general sentences. You know, if you're not doing anything fancy, if you're not asking a question, if you're just declaring something. Prepositions are the first part of prepositional phrases in English. There are some exceptions in poetic context, let's say, but as a rule, that's a pretty strong one. And determiners are the first parts of noun phrases, as we've already said. So that's a useful one. For example, determiners can both be the and this, but also Bob's or Susie's. And given that Susie and Bob are also nouns, if you want to know if it's being used as a determiner, one way of doing that is saying, you know, Bob's Susie lives over the mountain. She lives over the mountain. Okay, so Bob's Susie is clearly the noun phrase. Bob's is the one to the left. It must be a determiner as well as a noun. And then finally, substitutions were the other one we looked at. And we didn't discuss this beforehand, so Dylan, Rachel, and I, so they may or may not have used this terminology, but this is often known as proform substitution. I'm going to type it in the chat for a second. And the reason for that is because we all know what pronouns are, but in fact, there's other pro forms. You can have proverbs, you can have sort of pro adverbs, and so on. And so substitutions are also a very powerful one. And one of the reasons why they're so powerful is they are purely syntactic tests that really draw on your speaker intuitions. So only noun phrases and nouns can be replaced by pronouns. We've used this a dozen times already in this lecture. Here's the flip side of that. Pronouns are the only things that have antecedents like this. So in my section, for example, we were looking at what is hers as opposed to her. So if you say her book, her is a personal pronoun in the possessive case. What is hers? And what would it replace? And so we initially thought maybe it replaces, you know, her, whoever she is. Like, this is Susie's book. This is her book. This is hers. Okay, what's hers replacing? Well, maybe it's replacing Susie, right? Because that's feminine and singular. But it's not. It's replacing book. It's replacing the noun phrase book. And how did we work that out? We looked for the antecedent. What was it we replaced? When, if we were to expand the pronoun, what would we put in its slot? Inflected verbs and verb phrases can be replaced by what is known as the proverb do. And a really good way of doing that is if somebody says a question, says a sentence, just ask them if it's true, basically. She shoots well. Does she? She is the subject, and it appears in both cases. Do is a lexically empty, a semantically empty verb that is only replacing the verb phrase. And so that tells you that shoots well is the verb phrase. Adverbs, adverb phrases, adverbials are the only thing that can be replaced by thus or thusly. I ran quickly, I ran thus, I ran thusly. Prepositions and adverbials are the only things that can be replaced by deictic adverbs. That's a fancy one. We didn't actually cover this in my section, but that's here and there, thing, and the when and then. Deictic means that you're referring outside to the real world around the sentence. So Susie lives over the mountain. She lives there. There is basically a proform for adverbial prepositional phrases. There's a couple of other ones, but I just, these slides and this video will be available for you to review. So I wanted to get some of them on the slide, really. Whoops, there we go. Grammatical functions. In my section, we didn't really cover this as much as I should have, but nevertheless, it's worth talking about it and we'll return to this a fair bit. And so one of the things that we did in our sections was we kept talking about, in most cases, word classes and phrase classes are basically equivalent. Anything you can do with the word class when it's standing by itself, you can do with the phrase, the same phrase, when it's a phrase. So anything you can do to a noun, you can do to a noun phrase, except the inflection issue. Well, that's really useful because one of the great things about the way we think about syntax nowadays is the way we understand sentences. And basically, all simple sentences consist of a noun phrase plus a verb phrase. Murray calls them, and this is a more traditional way of talking about them, a subject and a predicate. And what that really means is basically the topic of the sentence plus some statement or claim about that topic. But if you think about it, that's very much a logic or content-based understanding. And I know in Rachel's section, she used the example that shows up with passives. And with passives, if you think about it for a second, Sam hit the train. Sam was hit by the train. A lot of people, if you ask them, say, well, what's the subject of the second one? They'll say the train. But that's not true. Sam's still the subject. He's just not the agent, right? And so that's why you can end up in trouble if you try to think about it. What's the sentence about and what claim is being made about them? A much easier way of understanding that is find the noun phrase, find the verb phrase, and together they are the sentence. And then you can have meaningless sentences like colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Or colorless green ideas were hit furiously. Colorless green, now I can show this is a sentence by proform substitution. The first one, colorless green ideas sleep furiously, they do. Colorless green ideas were hit badly, they were. So even though one of them is a regular sentence and it feels like, or let me put it like this, colorless green ideas were hit by Bob. It feels to many of us like Bob is somehow the topic of this sentence. But in fact, I can still show colorless green ideas were hit by Bob. They were. By Bob is still in the verb phrase. So we're going to break things into noun phrases and verb phrases. That's why it's so crucial to be able to tell what nouns are and what verbs are. And so we're going to be doing tests like that proform substitution in your own translations. And so I've got an example here. The candidate who was winning the popular vote nevertheless lost the electoral college when all was said and done. I want you to tell me, and everybody's got to write this down then, and I want to know what is the subject and what is the predicate of this sentence, or conversely, since sentences consist of one noun phrase and one verb phrase, there's more complicated things than that for what we're doing for right now. What is the noun phrase and what is the verb phrase? You can write it on your own papers, but also somebody want to throw it in chat? Or yell it out loud even. Anybody got it? What's the noun? And you got to show it to me too, eh? The candidate who lost is the subject. Okay, but you're cheating here. You're not doing the exact language. That's a meaning thing, right? I have to figure out, it doesn't say the candidate who was lost. Okay, I'm going to go to the next one then. You look at what I replace. She lost the electoral college when all was said and done. Shows you that the candidate who was winning the popular vote is the noun phrase. And the candidate who was winning the popular vote did. Shows you that lost the electoral college when all was said and done is the verb phrase. She did. And nevertheless, well, it's an adverb. It can be anything. It can go anywhere it wants. It can be, nevertheless, the candidate who was winning the popular vote lost in the electoral college when all was said and done. Or the candidate who was winning the popular vote nevertheless lost the electoral college when all was said and done. Or the candidate who was winning the popular vote lost in the electoral college when all was said and done, nevertheless. So nevertheless, This gets incredibly complicated when you start trying to account for that. We're never going to go near that in this course, but for our purposes, we can break that into two parts by just doing that proform substitution. And that means you can do that with every single sentence, no matter how complicated it gets. Ultimately, it comes down to she said or she did. Great. I'm going to just, I want to get through grammatical functions. I got like 2 more slides, and then I'm going to show you something for your next work. So there's other grammatical functions that may or may not have come up in your class. Objects, indirect objects, adverbials, adjectivals, determiners, and there's various tests for these. I'm going to just show you them again. You can look at the slide for this to go into greater detail, but objects, this is where your knowledge of personal pronouns comes in, because personal pronouns have more cases. They have, unlike everything else, they have a subject case and an object case. They have a possessive case as well. For this one, unfortunately though, she, the feminine or the neuter, is not a good one. You want to use the masculine pronoun because it's got the full set, whereas she has, it's she, her, her. You can't tell them apart, but he is he, his, him. It's got 3 different forms. But so how do I know that Grendel's arms are the object of what Beowulf slashed? Well, one explanation is he's not going to slash something else, is he? But that's not a very good explanation because it's relying on my knowledge of how swords and monsters interact with each other. A much better one is to say he slashed them. I had to use the object case. Grendel's arms must be the object. Indirect objects, Beowulf gave Hrothgar the sword. Beowulf gave the sword to him. You could use him there as well, but I'll talk more about that when we talk about cases in Old English. Same with adverbials and proforms. Grendel's mother swam with great speed. Grendel's mother swam thusly. I can show that with great speed is therefore an adverbial. Adjectivals, you do the proform substitution. The second monster to show up did better. The second monster to show up, the second monster to show up did better. The second monster like that, the monster like that did better. And that's how you get at second to show up is adjectival. And then determiners, you do it by position. Hancho's people were not impressed by the story of what happened at Herod. He gets killed. Those people were not impressed. I just showed that Hancho is not is a determiner by substituting a different determiner for it. Morphology, we're going to actually have a whole lecture on that later, so we will deal with that later on, and generally it's not that hard in translation. So I got about a minute or two, but is there any questions first before I go on to just a quick thing to show you what you're going to be doing next week? Okay, I'm not seeing anything. I am being buzzed menacingly by a wasp. This is your first translation thing that you're seeing on the screen here. What we're going to do is on Monday, I'll give you a lecture where we talk about pronunciation, also about the script and a bunch of other things. But I just cut out the text and the glossary, and I just wanted to give you a really quick sort of working knowledge of this as you go forward. In the upper right, I've got the 3 different characters that show up in Old English that don't show up in modern English. The first 2, Thorn and Eth, are related to each other. They stand for the same sounds. And it's basically pretty much all the sounds we spell by TH. The, like as in thy, as in thigh, thistle, they will spell them with one of those 2 or both of them in fact. And the one that's joined together, like an A and E mushed together, that is a different sound. Anglo-Saxon scribes make a distinction between ah, which they spell with an A, and ah, which they spell with this thing. So when you see those characters, if we look at the second line, second word over, on quath hem thus toe. We'll also, it's got length marks over the letters. When you're copying it out, you should copy out those length marks as well. because Old English makes a distinction between long and short vowels, which we don't do. And then finally, at the end of the text, each page, there's a glossary. And in the very beginning, the glossary will show you the word in the form it is in the text, and then it will tell you what that is. So I'm going to look up God. There it is. Strong, masculine, nominative, singular, God. We don't need to know much about this yet, except nominative means subject. I've got a crash course. I'll send a link out to you. Singular, you know what that means. The next word, wolde, it says it's third person singular preterite indicative, and it means wanted. Murray says at the very top, he's got an explanation for what those words mean. You know, third person singular preterite indicative, actually in the gloss. If you want to try this out over the weekend, feel free to. If you find it scary or you think you're going to need more hand-holding to get started, that wouldn't surprise me at all. In that case, take the weekend off and read chapter 2. And then what we'll do is the Tuesday, I'll show you more information about it. And then on Wednesday in our sections, we'll go through this quite slowly. Okay? One last thing, if you are going to try it this weekend, I'll just tell you quickly how I recommend doing it. Write out the Old English by hand. Keep 4 lines at least between each line of Old English, and then write out everything you see above the Old English word that it matches. And then if you want to, write out a running translation. But I really strongly recommend write on one side of the page, 4 lines separating each line of Old English, and I'll explain more about why when we get there next week. Okay, we're over time again, but I will take questions now, but of course, if you're running off to another class or something, you're free to go. If you've got any questions, though, I'm waiting and willing.
Sorry, where do we find the text for the biblical text?
Yep, it's in the gentle introduction, and then they're at the back.
Oh.
So, and then later on, Charlie will be going to the gentle reader, but that's much later, or the reader, but that's much later in the semester. But you'll see it, there's a separate section at the back there.
Yep. Got it.
Brianna, Sydney, any questions?
No, sorry, I was actually just looking at the
Yep.
slide.
No problem. All right, well then, thank you very much.
Thanks.
The rest of you guys, anything for me, or are we good?
I think we're good.
Yeah, I think we're all right. I think they're pretty well prepped for the next stage in the work that is going to be